Hello everyone, I'm Samantha Jane Smith.
And I'm Jacob Keynes, and you are listening to the Classical Queer Podcast. My name is Jacob Keynes, and this month we're joined by Aidan Feldkamp. Aidan is a classically trained opera vocalist turned librettist and writer and arts administrator while also maintaining performances. We chat with Aidan about a book that they curated that is the first edition of repertoire for trans voices in the world. Sammy and I hope you enjoy our chat with Aidan on the Classical Queer Podcast.
So welcome everyone to the next episode of the Classical Queer Podcast. And this week, Jacob and I are pleased to welcome Aidan Feldkamp, who is a librettist, producer, writer, and educator, which puts us to shame, really, only doing one thing at a time. So that's it's great to have you here, Aidan.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
No problem at all. So we'll start with our usual way of starting, which is, could we ask you to say a little bit about yourself and tell us a bit of your background and how you got into writing librettos?
Sure. So I'm a trans non-binary writer and creator. I'm trying to put everything under one word, but it's always hard. I've realized I just love to build things, and that thing can be a libretto. That thing could be an anthology, a project, a program. So, but I started as a cellist, playing cello in Hicksville, New York, which sounds fake but is real. And I grew up in the little suburban life on Long Island, New York. I try to hide my accent, but it comes through sometimes. And I went to school for music and actually discovered opera while I was in undergrad and absolutely fell in love. Started to study as a mezzo-soprano and went on to do that, sing professionally, went to Bard College Conservatory of Music for a master's, had an amazing time working there with Kaio Obama and Dawn Upshaw, and got into new music there. And since then was doing mostly Baroque music and new music. And then I hit kind of a wall of health issues and then also just needing to transition. And so I was like, well, what am I going to do with opera that isn't singing? And realized that I love to write. I've been writing since I was, younger. I had a few short stories published, had some poetry published. And I was like, well, why don't I try writing opera? Like, why not? So I started and I haven't stopped. I really love it. And so that's kind of where I'm at now. And my day job, I work at the American Composers Orchestra as their Director of Composer Advancement and Diversity. So I came into classical music admin as a diversity specialist and have since been working with composers and new music and creating training programs and accessible opportunities there. So yeah, it's been fun.
Fantastic.
That's fantastic. Yeah, what a great little CV there. I mean, it's kind of interesting to see how people move across the field, as it were, starting in one thing and then morphing into another. It was kind of, when I was looking at your website, there were a couple of quotes on there I just have to read out because I think they were fantastic. The first one was a New York Times one, and it said, "Upending preconceptions about voice and gender," which I think is something I think we're gonna talk about quite a bit, I think, during today. The other one, which I really think is fantastic, is Aidan's written work spans the serious and the ridiculous, the real and the surreal, and that just I think it's amazing that you can get that kind of quote. So tell us a little bit about your sort of span of work. I mean, it's kind of interesting. You've got this sort of serious, ridiculous, surreal type feel to it. It's kind of a wide range.
I mean, to be honest, I love to write comedy, and I'm a very pretty lighthearted person, but I seem to really get drawn into these projects that are really serious. And so in my writing background, I started as a sci-fi writer. It's what has been my impetus for writing. Okay. I love science fiction. And and then as an emo teenager started writing poetry and kind of never stopped. And so I came from this background of this like kind of very serious poetry and this very like fun and lighthearted action sci-fi side. And then as I got into opera and started like getting into the history side of classical music, I became very interested in historical fiction and in learning about the people that were creating these works that I loved so much. And so in undergrad, I did a project. I wrote like a novella about Mozart creating Così fan tutte and like what it was like to be an opera singer in that time, and like went and like looked through the annals of the opera house and like what day did they rehearse and where did they rehearse and who was in the cast and who's that cast person dating at the time, and like kind of like reading diaries and letters, and I found that I really loved that side of history, that like first person side of history. And so since then, I think a lot of my libretto writing has come from that place. Like I've written about Clara Schumann, I've written now about Eva, who we'll talk about in a little bit. And yeah, so I kind of get pulled into these like historical fiction side writing, and I do really enjoy it because it's this combination of like real life emotional stuff, but then this also like researchy, nitty gritty kind of side of things where it's a world that is ours but isn't ours because it's so long ago. And that's kind of like where the science fiction comes in, that like it's our world but it's different. And so I think that is the connection there that I find really exciting.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I'm a known science fiction geek. I just love all science fiction, and kind of there's quite a lot of commonality between history and science fiction. I feel, you know, it's looking out of time, and you kind of, it gives you more freedom in a sense than talking about the immediate present. So I can kind of see how the two link together. It's kind of an interesting, you know, juxtaposition of the two extremes, if you like, of the past and the future.
Yeah.
And it makes a lot of opera sense to me as well. Like, opera is such a, like, elevated, camp, weird, like, fantasy world at the best of times anyway. And it's funny you say you came to opera through, emo teenage poetry writing. Like, that makes sense for opera, too. Like, that's a very opera thing. Like, opera's so... all of those things that it may not seem on the surface to be a kind of a happy marriage, but yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about. We'll go to the book. Let's talk about the book because this is quite an exciting thing. You've curated a new anthology of new music for trans and non-binary. It's going to be one of those shows for trans and non-binary voices. So tell us a little bit about how this book came about. I mean, is this something you just sort of thought this sounds fun, or how did you get to there?
So it's actually a few things kind of culminating together, as it usually goes. I've been thinking a lot for the past few years, before transitioning physically and then since, about like how does voice and gender connect? How do voice types and gender connect? And it was something that I was kind of talking with my friends a lot about. And when I was on one of my trips for American Composers Orchestra, I was speaking with Franco Thierry, who's the editor of New Music Box. He works for New Music USA, and I was talking about this idea of gender and voice, and it's something that he's worked a little bit with in his own compositional works. And he said, you know, why don't you write for New Music Box about this? It's such an interesting topic, and no one's really talked about it. And I was like, cool, let's do it. And so we sat down and like worked out this like 4-part series about gender, about voice type, about how we can kind of begin to uncouple them, and how it's not only for the benefit of trans and non-binary people, but also cisgender people who are gender non-conforming. Like if I'm a slightly masculine cis woman, you know, like they also kind of fight these stereotypes of voice type, or even someone whose voice is just kind of sitting between voice types as we think of them, like how they're kind of like punished because their repertoire doesn't fit this specific box. So kind of speaking about that, and as I was doing that work, you know, thinking back to my time singing art song and opera, and thinking about what were the roles that I felt most attracted to, what were the songs, and how I kind of really struggled with gender and voice in art song, in opera. and was like, I wonder if there's repertoire out there beyond what I know, like written specifically for ungendered voices or non-binary voices or trans voices. And I was following, trans singers at the time who were creating the first roles written as trans characters in opera. And it was all very exciting, but like I was looking and looking because I was like, surely someone's put together something, like, and
yeah, it must be there somewhere.
There must be there. And so I was looking and looking, and ever since I wrote those articles, I've been getting emails and calls and messages on Facebook from people I know, people I don't know, who are either voice teachers or trans and non-binary singers themselves saying, do you have repertoire for this? And I was like, yes, but like, I always want to like send them somewhere to look and to explore on their own and somewhere to start, and answering the same question over and over again. I was like, there's not an anthology. There should be an anthology. And at the exact same time, I was accepted as a Turn the Spotlight Fellow, which is a nonprofit that works with women, trans, and non-binary arts leaders to create projects, to offer mentorship, to offer support. And so I was like, this is going to be my project. And so, with their help and, we reached out to New Music Shelf. They were super into it. They'd never done an anthology that wasn't voice type specific, so this was like a first. But it was also a first because there's no anthology about for trans and non-binary singers. Which, like, again, I was just like, why hasn't anyone done this? I guess so. That's kind of my mentality of life. It's like if someone hasn't done it and you think that you can do it, you should. And I feel that with my background that I'm, I really know what I'm doing here. And also I had the help that I needed of like, a publisher, and Kathy Kelly, who was my mentor with Turn the Spotlight, like her and all of the mentors in Turn the Spotlight, all of their knowledge and expertise, like helped me with the skills that I already had and the knowledge I already had to build this thing. And so like, it really was a team effort, but I felt happy that I could put my skills, my specific skills to use and create something that didn't exist and that others can benefit from. So I'm so excited. It's out in the world, and it was such a joy to like not only have all this new music that I knew and didn't know coming to me and exploring it and learning it, and then putting it together into something that showcases it, that gives it a platform. That just makes me really happy. So this has been my favorite project, and it's been throughout COVID, so it's had some weird setbacks, but it's happened. And so it's something I've looked to through this time, of like something that's exciting and joyful to build.
It was kind of interesting because Ryan Gleave, who was one of the people I was talking to a little while ago, and he said, by the way, have you seen this book? I said, book? What book? And he said, this anthology, it's coming out, it's really, really great. And I went, oh yeah, it's kind of interesting, it's an anthology. And I said, so are there must be lots of these out there. Just like you said. And it was like, Ryan was like, no, you don't understand. You do not understand. This is the first anthology there is. You have to go and look, you have to do. So it was kind of interesting. And it may sound quite, to a lot of people, maybe a little over-egged, but it really is the first time that something like this has been put together. And I think that's really unique. And I think it's absolutely superb that this has come out, to be honest.
I just hope there's more. That's all I have to say. Sorry.
Yeah.
I think there absolutely will be. I mean, given the list of people, I was looking through the composers, like it's so like encouraging and exciting that there are so many people, even in volume 1, and so many people that I have never heard of, and people that I'm excited to like explore. And it's, these things are not easy projects to do, obviously. Like they're huge undertakings. And like you say, to have done it even in the past 2 years, like under COVID world, like that's hard enough to do under a normal kind of set of circumstances. But how did you go about contacting everybody? Like, I'm assuming there are many new names to you, some people you knew. What was that process like to kind of build this from scratch? Because there is no model, there is no past jumping off point.
Yeah, so I'm lucky actually, because my day job that I've had for the past 4 years or so, a huge component of it is running these readings programs. And part of the orchestral reading program is taking in submissions and going through the review process and reading the ones that will be read. So, you get 300 applications and you can choose 12. How do you do that? And then coming in, why I was hired was that the applications were predominantly white, predominantly cisgender male, predominantly from a specific set of conservatories, and that was it. And so I was like, well, it's recruitment time, And so I completely rebuilt their whole process. And now I'm so excited we get over 50% of the applications are from Black, Indigenous, people of color artists. Up to 30% of them are women. We have almost 10% trans and non-binary, which, again, these are all new people to me, which is so exciting because it's and so going into this process, I just went through it like I would with the Earshot readings. And, obviously I have the admin help of the publisher, but, we put together a call for scores. We had a specific set of criteria. And then, obviously I recruited people I knew, but I also went through the recruitment processes that I had put together for these other things of reaching out to people in a way, or schools in a way that you don't know these people, but you reach out to them with the information and ask them to pass it on, or you reach out to others who might have references and then you reach out to them. And it's a lot of this invitation. And so it was a mix of people who just heard about it through someone that wasn't me. And then, people that I did know, actually actively recruiting them. And so it was a mix. And it was so exciting. I got so much music from people I'd never heard of and didn't know. Like Rylan, I met through this project. Never heard his work before, and it's so good. Yeah. So, so I was very lucky. We had so many submissions, and we easily have enough stuff for another volume today. So,
fantastic. Fantastic.
Yeah. So good. And so I'm assuming that's the next step. You're going to be working on volume 2.
I don't know. I'm not saying it. I'm not promising anything. But, the publisher and I are just kind of going through all the publicity for this one and, trying to make sure as many people as possible know it exists. Because, what a joy it would be to be a non-binary singer coming into undergrad. You go to your school's music library and you look through the anthologies and you find one for you, that's what I want, that's my dream.
Yeah, as it should be.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that should be, as you say, in every conservatory, every university, every teaching place, that there is something for trans and non-binary voices. It should be the standard work in a sense. So there we go. We've sold that one, I think, to everyone. We've just sold 1 million copies around the world there for you. So that's a fantastic book, but of course that's not the only thing you do. There's the curation of the book, which has been absolutely fantastic, but there's libretto work you do as well. And we're going to start by talking about Space Station 189, because this just absolutely blew me away, to be honest. So introduce Space Station 189 for the audience, please, Aidan.
Sure. So Space Station 189 is an Instagram opera, I think, is what they're calling it. So basically, it's 7 episodes. Each one is 1 minute long. And it explores what's happening to a woman who works on a space station by herself. And the idea is that it's in this future where, kind of like now, there's these jobs that nobody wants, but you have to take them because you have to make money. And so one of these jobs is kind of sitting up on this space station monitoring. And no one really talks back to you. You're kind of talking to yourself, giving reports and sending information back down to Earth or to other space stations, but you're not really getting any human contact. And so it's about this woman, she's on the space station and she hears something that's not supposed to be there. And so it kind of for a moment it becomes a bit horror because it's this question of what's happening. And then at the end has this very kind of sci-fi ending. But so the story was my idea, but the project was not. So Lisa Nair, who is a mezzo-soprano, and she also kind of commissions a lot of new work, and JL Marler, who is the composer. Her name is Jess. So Jess has been a friend of mine for quite a while, and we always look for ways to work together. And so she actually came to me with this project. She's like, I want to write about being this isolation and this like self-reflection that comes from isolation, but I don't know what I want to do with it, except for that I want it to be super poetic, and I want to use a lot of electronics in the music, and it's for one singer, and just like a micro opera, and and I can't find anyone to write it who's like poetic enough, but also constructing a plot around it, so it's not so loose that there's nothing happening. And I was like, well, you came to the right person. Let's make a thing. And so it was really fun because it's like, I had a lot of flexibility in the plot, and I had a lot of flexibility in the character and things like that. I just, had to follow this theme that Jess had in mind, and Lisa was the singer, and I knew that. So kind of building something around that. And so this is actually definitely the loosest and most poetic sci-fi thing I've ever written. And it was really fun, and just really amazing job with it. Brought it to life in a way that only she can. So
yeah, we're going to hear a little bit of it now. So we're going to hear. So the fantastic thing about this is it's Instagram opera. So it's 7 1-minute episodes, which I think is just absolutely brilliant in trying to work that out. So we're going to listen to episode 1, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it.
It's not like anyone's listening. Day 315, Space Station 189. Maybe now it'll feel less ridiculous to talk out loud when I'm all alone. Not today. That's right. I need to work with my heart, even though I
Yeah, I am always curious about like a collaboration between librettist and composer, because I've commissioned several things in the past, and I've worked with librettists and I've worked with a lot of composers, and it's always the question of like which comes first and who collaborates the first with whom and all that kind of stuff. And so and maybe especially because it's electronic based, it's maybe harder to start with the music and overlay lyric in, but who did what first, and how did it all come about?
Yeah, so I can't speak for everyone, but I know that generally the librettist will start writing first, and then the composer will add their music, and then the amount of collaboration or change to the libretto at that point is extremely variable, depending on the person and the collaboration and everything. And even with me, it's like each composer I work with is a totally different experience. But I'm not the kind of librettist who's very good at hearing music and setting words to it. I'm very much, I'm hearing, like, I'll write the text and I will hear, like, the rhythmic structure, or, if we're setting some kind of, like, rhyme structure, or if it's totally loose, like, but I'm very rhythmic in my writing, in my poetry in general, and so it kind of lends itself well to being set to music in that way. But it's also usually not super uniform unless the composer really wants it. So it's a bit more free form. So I think it works well for Jess's writing style, because she very much comes from not only opera, but this kind of like punk rock lyric sound. And so the combination of the two is really fun. And so I know that about her work, and so I wrote the piece with that in mind. But generally I'll write it out. The composer will look at it, ask for changes, I'll change it, then they'll start to set it. Sometimes when they're setting it, they'll ask for changes again. Jess actually didn't for this one. So generally, like, I changed maybe a word or two here, but mostly after it was done, she set it as is, and like we kind of went from there. Which is not how it always goes, but that's how it went with her. And it was a really quick process. She's like a fast writer, I think. Maybe it was just this project, but I feel like it happened really fast. Usually I write a libretto and then I forget that it ever happened. And then a year later I hear it set to music and I'm like, wait, I wrote that?
I know those words.
Yeah. So it's kind of like, Usually there's way more space. But this one, it was kind of like a really quick turnaround, and then it existed, and it was just really cool. But the collaboration between us was very much upfront. It was figuring out the theme ahead of time, figuring out the style ahead of time, figuring out the plot, okaying the plot with her, okaying the character with her, working through kind of, she had a really specific soundscape in mind. And so actually she would share that with me. We actually built like a playlist of other songs that had like similar sounds that we were sharing. There were images that we were sharing back and forth. And so we kind of really were focusing on mood. We were focusing on theme. And then I kind of built the lyrics around that. But there was a lot of work ahead of time, a lot of like table work before I started writing.
Did you do a lot of research for writing this? I mean, did you go away and look at astronauts' transcripts of the space station or the shuttle or something? I'm just kind of curious.
That's really interesting. This is the one I definitely did the least amount of research on, but I think it's because like it's something I followed for my whole life. Like I've been super interested in the space station that is up there now, and I've been following its progress as long as I can remember. So it's kind of like, it has been researched, but like kind of just passively over time myself. But I think a lot of my research came from actually watching like old Doctor Who and old Twilight Zone. Like that really influenced this piece more than anything, actually, more than real life, to be honest.
But it's kind of interesting because I mean, I sound like I'm name dropping. I worked some years ago in the US, and I worked for NASA at the time and I was working with the shuttle, and we were talking to some of the astronauts and this kind of thing. And one or two of the things you actually put in there kind of sound like some of the things they said, particularly this sort of fascination with sound, and you know, any little sound that's out of the ordinary. You know, everything is immediately a heightened sense of. What is, are we doomed now? Is there something that's dooming us because something's happened and this kind of thing? And they were always like on this heightened sort of like edge of that. And I kind of get that from some of what you've got in there. Is this, you know, when there's this thing happening, you know, sort of thing, which we don't know about. And it's, so it's kind of interesting that you sort of got that, even though you didn't research into that.
That's super interesting. That's really cool. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Well, it was kind of fascinating because, you know, also the bit about, I think is also quite interesting, you know, when you're isolated, this bit about sleeping for so long and always feeling tired, I think is quite, really common. So it kind of is like, although it's set in a space station, I think is quite common it has a common feeling for people who are lonely or isolated as well. You know, the back on Earth, if you like, you know, somebody who is isolated, who doesn't have contact, who doesn't have family, friends, and this kind of thing. So it's a little bit like being stuck in your flat and having nobody to talk to.
Yeah, it's definitely that's definitely where I was writing from.
Okay, yeah. So well, you hit it. I think is the thing. I think we got that. I think from that. So it's kind of interesting.
And now, I think it paired nicely. Sorry, with the compositional style. I mean, like electronics and voice are certainly not necessarily a new pairing, but to add the element of, you know, space and isolation, and how do you go down that road without it being too kitsch or too on the nose? You know, how do you pair lyrics with that music without it being like too cartoony and kind of spacey? But I think it hit like such a nice balance of obviously it's talking about space and the references are very clear, but it's not so over the top and on the nose that it kind of takes you out of being invested in the story. And I don't know, did you think about how that would translate while you were writing the libretto at all?
Being on the nose or too on the nose is literally like my greatest fear when writing any libretto. Because to me, like opera, it does ride this very fine line of like being so extravagant, like everyone's singing all the time, but yet not too much unless it's meant to be like very kitschy. Like there's times where that's needed and awesome, but like often you don't want that. So it's, and like being able to tell the story without like telling it like this is what's happening, and like being obscure enough but not too obscure that people can't follow it. So I mean, to me, like when I listen to an opera and the libretto is like really on the nose, it really bothers me. Like I feel like myself like cringing in the audience, you know, and I think that's one of the things. I try not to write from fear of anything, really, but if I do have a fear of something, it's definitely of being like too on the nose, like just hitting the nail too hard. And then, because I think you lose art there, like you lose the art form. Like that's not when things are at its best. So I'm glad that it didn't do that.
No, there's like a power in the subtlety. It's kind of, I mean, for something again that is so like clearly placed, you're writing about like a really specific set of things and thoughts, but it really is quite subtle given how specific we are talking about, like space, you know.
I think it also builds this tension as well, which I kind of think when you're not, you know, if you're talking like A happens then B then C, you don't build a tension. But if you're describing around it and you're letting the person listening's imagination work on that, then you're building some kind of tension in the story. And I think that's kind of what's nice about this, is that, you know, there's the hidden stuff is for your imagination to fill in the gaps, which I kind of like.
Yeah, I think leaving space for the listener or the reader or whoever's like experiencing your story, leaving space for their imagination is really crucial to me. Because I love world building, I love character building, and I never want to like push all of it on to the reader or the listener, because I think that having that space to imagine is actually that space to connect. Because if the person experiencing the piece doesn't connect to it, like, to me, what's the point? You know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in a piece like this, where you've got this this noise, we won't go into what it is if people want to listen to this, but you've got like you've got this sound, and it kind of like, you know, it takes you back to like kind of like horror stories. You know, it's the sound you had as a kid somewhere, and this kind of thing. And when you see the horror film actually put out before you, I always I start laughing, because you actually see what the horror is. The horror stories are actually much more, you know, horrifying if you don't see what it is, and it's hidden, and it's your imagination which is working. And that's kind of what you've got here. What is this happening? What is going on? I can make up 100 stories here every single time, and everyone is different. So it sort of gives you a chance to have more stories than there are episodes, if you see what I mean. You can build up from it into a different world, as it were.
Yeah.
And maybe a good transition to, I mean, talking about building stories and building character, that, you know, we have this a fictional story that you create, you write, and then transitioning to talking about this other piece that we want to talk about today, Ava and the Angel of Death, that you have like a very real human and a very clear story. And how does your writing change when you are telling somebody else's very lived experience? And maybe we'll start with, maybe before we get into that, tell us about the piece in general, and then we'll kind of unpack it a bit.
Sure. Eva and the Angel of Death is a Holocaust remembrance opera based on the real-life lived story of Eva Moses Kor, who was a I don't want to say participant. Like, she was part of the twin experiments in Auschwitz by Dr. Mengele. And so what was happening there was, if you came into Auschwitz and were a kid or a teenager and you had an identical twin, they would actually take you aside, and you'd be part of these experiments that Dr. Mengele was doing. And it all connects to this horrible idea of the master race and genetics and eugenics. And they were very interested to see how two identical twins would respond differently over time and to different stimulus, and unfortunately also just to torture, like absolutely horrible. But the thing about Eva and the Angel of Death that's super interesting is that the story, it starts in Auschwitz, but it doesn't end, and it ends there. But it's all about how Eva changes her life in a way that brings forgiveness and healing to her from the trauma that she went through as a child, and how does it change you? And it expands 50 years of her life. And when I was actually, it's not a story that I chose. It's a story that kind of like came to me as a writer. And I was just intrigued and concerned that I wasn't up to the task when I first read it. But it's such an incredible story. I just could not pass it by. And like, and it's just something that really needs to be told and is just becoming more and more important every year. And so the composer, Thomas B. Yee, he's actually, he's done quite a bit of Holocaust remembrance art. And he's a real, scholar in this area. And it's something that I've done a few times before this, actually. So this isn't my first piece about this, but it's definitely the one that was the most immediate, because Eva, when I started writing, was still alive. And so I actually got to meet her, speak with her, interview her. It was such an incredible experience. I mean, whenever I write about someone, they've passed away many years ago. And here was someone that I was writing about them, and they were physically there, and like I could speak with them. And she had a lot of, interviews, and she had written a book, which is what this is based on. So there was a lot of source material to work with, but also just speaking with her and meeting her. And so my writing style changed completely for this piece, because I wanted to capture her voice and she has a very specific way of speaking. And it's really interesting, because when I first heard her, when I first watched her interviews, I'm like, oh, this is going to be tricky, because in opera, everything has to be very fluid. Everything has to be very, vowel centric. And her speech is extremely like forward and chopped, and English is her second or third or fourth language. It's not her first language. And so coming from that too, you hear like the internal translation happening, and she's also such a gifted speaker at this point, because she's done so much speaking. And so hearing this like very polished speaking voice, but then also her personal voice, and then her written voice, which is different again. And how do we bring all those together to be accurate and to be honoring her and her legacy and her personhood, but then also telling a story, and a story that, like with the other story, that people will relate to, that people have a way to connect to. It's all about family. It's all about forgiveness, about how do we move on from trauma? How do we heal ourselves? And her idea of healing and of moving forward is about forgiving those who've wronged you. And she's kind of known for forgiving the Nazis and forgiving Dr. Mengele, who was not only like her torturer, but also the cause of her twin sister's death. And so like, how do you reconcile that? And her answer to reconciling and to moving forward and healing is what the opera is about.
Yeah, I think I must admit, for me, I think I would have, if I was in this position of having to write a libretto for this, I think I would have been really panicked about trying to do justice to such a difficult topic. Because it's almost one of those subjects where whatever you do, you're going to be damned if you write one thing and damned if you don't, sort of thing. It's kind of one of those things that I can just see. Did it ever cross your mind about what you were getting into? I mean, did you suddenly go, oh my God, this is just way too complicated, or way too difficult, emotional?
Yeah. I mean, I take, these kinds of projects really seriously. And so, I mean, I really did a lot of research and a lot of thinking before I even took on the project. But I knew that it was important, and I knew that I had the skill set for it. And then I knew that I had people that I could go to help me. That's always the thing. It's about surrounding yourself with people that can help you in the places that you aren't as skilled or would need an extra boost because it's just a challenge. And then also knowing and assessing, do I have the technical skills and do I have the emotional intelligence to do this piece? And sometimes the answer is no. But here I genuinely felt that through my research and thinking and, work that I've done in the past and who I am as a person, that I felt that I was able to do this. And it was extremely daunting, but I kind of love a challenge. So there's also that part of me that was like, oh, this is going to be something I've never done before. And I do think that, taking on a challenge expands your artistry. It flexes your muscles and makes you better at what you're doing if you do it right. And, and the way that I wrote it would be different than anyone else writing the same piece. That's always the way it goes. And so I was happy to bring my voice to it, but also to not have that be the center in any way. I think I'm furthest back in this piece as a writer than any other piece I've written, because I really did want Eva's voice to shine and the others in her life that are part of the opera, but also just this story of one acknowledging that the Holocaust happened, which was a huge part of her work, was advocating, because there were people even at the time who were just denying the Holocaust, and she's like, no, we need to have this document. We need to have these testimonies on file. We need to have the information about what happened there. Everyone needs to know. There can't be anyone denying this. It was a huge part of her work. And so that's a huge part of the opera. But then, this idea of, I want to talk about trauma in the piece, but I never want to re-traumatize those who would be most affected by the topic. And so that's another aspect of work, especially in the Holocaust remembrance work, but in other work as well, that if you're talking about something traumatic, you always want to create a piece that makes others who are not part of that trauma aware and understand, but never re-traumatizing those who are most affected or would understand most what you're talking about. So that was the other kind of thing that I always had in my mind as I was writing this. So Act 1 does take place in Auschwitz, but Act 2 takes place 50 years later in America. And it never gets super dark in the first act, because even though we're in Auschwitz, she's 10 years old, and writing as a 10-year-old and how a 10-year-old understands what's happening around her is very different than her 50-year-old self looking back on it, or an adult writing from their point of view there. So in that way, we were able to, Thomas did a really fantastic job here too of it wasn't so dark that it was unbearable or re-traumatizing, but it's also what's going on. And you hear that, in the aria that I brought today, it's Eva, looking at the smokestacks of the gas chambers. And, we as the audience know that, but the only thing she sees is what she physically sees. And then, being I have to survive no matter what. And, that's her answer to everything is, I have to survive no matter what. My sister has to survive no matter what. That's the only thing on her mind. So that's kind of where the story is. So I think I answered your question. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think again, there's a good example here of as you said, the balance between being too obvious and sort of, I mean, you could have gone down a very dark route and described everything in excruciating detail, which, as you say, would probably re-traumatize a lot of people who really don't want to be re-traumatized. But here you've done this balance where you know what's going on, as you say, but you've kind of used the 10-year-old to keep us away from it in a way. You know it, but you don't have it right in front of you. And I think that's kind of a really clever way of doing it. I think that's really put something, very positive into the story there.
Well, we should have a listen.
So we've heard the smoke goes into the sky from Act 1 of Eva and the Angel of Death. Yeah, so this is as you said, is from the bit where the 10-year-old girl is looking at what's going on and basically saying they've got to survive, they've got to live their life and just get out of it. Did you actually ever show these words to Eva? I mean, was she still alive when you'd finished, and how did she react?
So she saw a first polished draft of the whole thing, but she saw Act 1 as it is now, and Act 2 almost completely as it is now. And I really wanted to make sure that she read it and approved of it before we move forward, because, you know, it's about her, it's about her life and her words. And she gave it the go-ahead, which made me very happy. And I didn't speak with her specifically after she read I spoke with her way before I started writing. But through her agent, we were kind of conversing, and, you know, she gave it the big thumbs up and didn't ask for any changes. So that to me was a stamp of approval, and, you know, having that was extraordinary. So she was very happy with it. I'm only sorry that, you know, she didn't get to see or hear more of it before she passed away, but you know, these things, it was just amazing to have met her, and I know that her, you know, story will have an impact for many years.
When did she pass away?
It was, I think it was 2020. It was the summer. So she would lead tours to Auschwitz I think it was twice a year, and would, you know, do a tour of the place, give speeches, talk about things, you know, her education and advocacy side. And so she was actually there in Auschwitz, or like outside of Auschwitz, where that is now, when she passed away, because she was leading one of those tours. And it was actually, I was supposed to be there that time, but I wasn't able to travel because of work. So it must have been 2019, I guess, because we were still traveling. We would have to check. But I remember I follow her on Twitter, and she's just like a big tweeter. And so like she was tweeting pictures of like her in McDonald's, like outside of Auschwitz, like eating chicken nuggets, being like, yeah, like she saw it as such a like, you know, like F you to everybody in Auschwitz, to like be there and be healthy and be eating what she wants, and like, you know, just existing and living. And so like that was her last thing that she tweeted before she like really unexpectedly passed away. And it was very weird, because it was like, you know, I found out about it like a day after it happened or so. And it, you know, it was really hard to take. And it was someone who, like, you know, I'd only met her once, and so it's not like I, you know, had a super strong connection to her in that way, but like, you know, as an artist and as a, you know, just like knowing her work and stuff, it was very strange that, like, you know, it's very full circle almost, that like I felt she was at peace, you know, and that's why she could pass away. And she's just, you know, it had a really positive impact on me and others. And, you know, that's the best you can say about someone, I think, is that, you know, they've had a positive impact on people and on the world, and that, you know, they passed in peace. And so it's just, yeah, it's very interesting. But yeah.
We can kind of contrast that with the second part of this, which is the mud scrabbling masses, which is the Mengele aria.
Yeah.
And this kind of, yeah. I mean, let me just read the last line, because I kind of, this last line for me is sort of a real fantastic line, is the mud scrabbling masses of lizard mediocrity. And I kind of find that line is just kind of just sits there. I don't know what I mean by that, but it kind of is a real sort of, I don't even know the word to describe it, but it kind of hangs there. It's sort of like a like something almost dark, I don't know, in it, and this kind of thing. How did I mean that's an amazing line. How did you come up with that line? Is the first thing. I mean, that's kind of, this is mediocrity.
Yeah, this aria was built from a single line of his that I read. He wrote an article about something horrible, I forget. But basically he was saying what the aria says at the beginning, that he believes that 90% of humanity will starve because of stupidity. Like that kind of the human race is doomed because most of it like can't even handle living, like can't even handle surviving. So like he had a really negative view of humanity, which is really obvious through his work and through his writing. But he's such a weird guy. He after the camp was liberated, he escaped to South America and was in hiding for a very long time, and they were trying to find him, and we don't even know like when or if he died. Like, it's very strange. But his writing about humanity and about his philosophy, there's a lot of it that we have, and I didn't read through all of it, and this was a tricky opera to do research for, because usually I go like really hardcore on the research, read a lot. This piece was so heavy and so emotionally taxing that I had to be extremely like strategic about my research, and so there was I really didn't do as much as I would, just because it was too hard to like read all of this and do all of that research. It took too much of an emotional toll. So what I did read a lot, there's not much that's like, most of the time when I do this kind of work, I take a lot of quotes from the people themselves. But Mengele, the only thing I took from him was this first line of the aria. And I built the entire aria from that, knowing, and I just wanted everyone to kind of know what was going on in his mind, like what he thinks that his work is about, what he thinks life is about, what his drive is, what his motivation is. It's his like motivation aria. And I find it really hard to write villains in general, but especially one that's a real person, and genuinely I don't want to make him redeemable in any way, because I can't my conscience, like I can't. But it's also like, you don't want to create a fake character, because then people are like, oh, if this like villain is fake, like these people don't exist. But these people do exist, and like the mundane people are often the most evil, because they're just going about their life like justifying what they're doing for whatever reason. And that's what he was doing. He was just going about his life justifying these horrible, horrible experiments, because he thought that he was doing humanity a favor of like figuring out how to make this like master race of humanity that would continue on and like overcome our stupidity, or overcome the mediocrity that evolution had given us. And so that's kind of where this came from. And also like, I was like, I could put dinosaur and lizard as words in an opera. I'm not going to pass that up. So
No.
He was super into Darwinism in a way that was creepy. So that's why that's kind of in there. It's alluding to that like fixation on evolution and what is greatness, what is mediocrity, how does genetics kind of determine our future.
And of course this is something which I think sadly we see too much of again today. It's kind of this you see the rise of eugenic arguments and this kind of thing. So I think it's very timely to have a reminder of these things. I mean, I think it's always timely to have a reminder of these things. We should never forget these, but I think it's kind of good that these things are coming out now again, because I think it reminds us when we're in the situation we're in, that these things happened and just how awful they are. I mean, the words are just too impossible to describe. So let's listen to that piece anyway. Let's listen to that aria. So this will be the Mud Scrambling Masses.
90% of humanity We'll start from stupidity. Will end in catastrophe. The gifted drowned by the without intervention, evolution will repeat itself, 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 repeat itself. Like a dinosaurs, before us greatness will abound.
Ausrottung des Menschenvolkes fordert die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
So that was Even the Angel of Death. That was The Mud Scrabbling Masses. I think we're kind of coming to the end of towards the end of the show. But before you go, Aidan, what's next for you? What things have you got coming up next? Give us a taster of what you've got for us.
Yeah, for sure. Even the Angel of Death is premiering in April on the 23rd and 24th in Austin, Texas. And will be accompanied by a lot of scholarly information, speeches, and museum things. And it's very cool. It's going to be very educational. And it is a positive opera, I promise. Like, it's very happy and uplifting at the end. And it's just really beautiful. And then in June, I have 2 different operas premiering. One of them is about Emily Dickinson, and it's actually premiering in her house at the museum in Amherst, which is
very cool.
Tickles me to no end. And it's about her relationship with her sister-in-law, Susan, and kind of her queerness and how her neurodivergency and her queerness were stifled in her time, and how she found ways to express that and express herself and find fulfillment for herself, despite being unable to, be with her, the person she loved the most, which was Susan. And so it's really great because I got to work with like a lot of her poetry that you'll recognize and a lot of it that you will not, and the letters between her and Susan, and it's being composed by Dana Kaufman, and it's really cool because it's for one voice for Emily, and then pre-recorded trio of voices, and electronics is the accompaniment. So it's super interesting because there's the libretto for Emily, but then there's also the libretto for the voices. And it's just a very cool piece. I'm so excited. And then the other one is with Strange Trace Opera. We're doing an opera called The Plague Bearer, which is based on a Polish medieval folktale of like a demon that brings the plague. And again, it seems like it would be a downer, but it's actually not. It's comedic mostly. I mean, obviously it's serious at times, but it's very cool. It has a non-binary blacksmith lead and a midwife who's being accused of being a witch is the other lead, and they get together at the end, which is my favorite. And it's got a lot of this old like Polish folk song sound in it, which was so cool to discover and learn for myself. To me, it sounds like metal, like it sounds like Metallica to me, but without the electronic instruments. It's really cool.
Very neat.
Yeah, so it's got this really gritty but also like lyric, like folksy sound to it. It's wonderful. Stephanie Lebowski is the composer on that, and we have the privilege of writing for the Strange Trace Opera Collective, so like I knew all the singers going in and wrote the pieces specifically for them, which has been really fun. So that's coming out in June as well. I think that will be a movie format, so before it goes to stage, it'll be out in film.
Wow.
And then hopefully in the nearest future, volume 2 of the anthology as well.
Yeah.
But we'll just keep fingers crossed that's not on the books yet.
If not by me, by someone else, I'm sure.
Well, thank you, Aidan. Thank you for being on the show, and keep in touch, and we'll talk to you again sometime in the future, I hope.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So that's all for this episode. You've been listening to the Classical Queer Podcast, and Jake and I look forward to being with you next month. The incidental music is courtesy of Jared Miller, and the show was produced by Samantha Jane.